now watching Wayback Wednesday, sponsored by Davenport Auto Park, the ride of your life. And also sponsored by Flores Glass, serving the area since 1977 with residential and commercial work.
Well, good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Wayback Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcox. Good to have you with us. Tonight we're going to finally finish up on this topic we've been on for the last couple of weeks now, old buildings, if you will, on Rocky Mount. And then we're going to shift gears slightly to another old building that's no longer in downtown Rocky Mount, but has a lot of neat history behind it, particularly the businesses that have occupied that building and the space immediately around that building. And so, you know, every now and again someone will call me or stop by my office and say, hey, I've got an idea for a show for you. And this week, our good friend Eric came by and asked me to check into a building. And so I did some research and digging. And I have to say I should remember this building, but I honestly do not. I have racked my brain trying to, I've even seen a picture. I found a picture of it. And when I saw it, I thought I should remember this. I mean, it was torn down while I was overseas in the Navy. But it was certainly still standing when I left to go in the Navy, and it was there through all of my childhood for that matter. So it blows my mind that I cannot remember this building physically. I know I never went inside of it. I'm sure I rode by it multiple times. But we'll get to that shortly. Before we do that, let's go back and kind of finish up. If you remember from the last couple of weeks, we're talking about buildings that were some of the oldest ones in Rocky Mount, dating back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. As I said last week, I was really surprised, frankly, that there are so many buildings still standing in Rocky Mount, houses too for that matter, I should include houses in that statement, that date back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so there were two or three we didn't get to last week. And then after last week, I had one of our other viewers, sent me 3 or 4 pictures of early Rocky Mount and some old buildings, some of which are still standing. So without further ado, let's jump right into this. Let's go to picture number 1. This is actually one that we didn't get to last week, and it's located on South Washington Street. The address is 148 to 152. You see I've got it highlighted there in yellow. And this 2-story brick commercial building was constructed for T.P. Brazel and occupied by the firm of Bullock Bird and Company in the early 20th century. A corbelled cornice and round arch windows enlivened the facade. The second-story windows on the facade and the 2 storefronts had been replaced since 1980. Double-hung sash and a side entrance were added to the north elevation as the neighboring 1-story commercial building was demolished. So this pair of buildings was one building, a couple spaces in the building, of course, was built in 1906. And if you ride down South Washington Street, you'll see this building is still there. And like I said, it was just amazing to me the number of these old buildings that are this old. All right, moving on, lead number 2, 109 Southeast Main Street. For those that are familiar with this part of Rocky Mount, you'll recognize the bank building immediately to the left as being the old People's Bank building. Epstein's there to your far left. But circled there in yellow, 109 Southeast Main Street. This 2-story brick commercial building with replacement scored concrete storefront, which includes the large aluminum frame windows, a brick entrance around, and partially bricked up arched second-story window openings with metal casement windows. The facade, which retains little integrity, had already been altered by 1980. This building had a 109 to 115 Southeast Main Street address in the 1980 nomination. What they're referring to here in this phrasing, this nomination, these buildings were in that historical registry that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago and again last week. And so when they were nominated for inclusion in this registry, that appeared at various times. The impetus to get this National Registry of Central Rocky Mount Business District started goes back to the 1980s, and indeed 1980 was when this building was recommended for inclusion or nominated for inclusion. And so it was literally a 25 or 30 year process to get these buildings identified, get the history on them, and find out when they were built. And by the way, just a point of note for those that are interested in such things, The Nash County GIS website, and Edgecombe County has one too, by the way. But if you do a Google search on Nash County GIS or Edgecombe County GIS, you can literally search by street address. You can search by parcel ID. Any number of ways to identify a property, and you can find out what it sold for, what the tax value is, and many times when it was built. And so just an interesting tidbit of information there to help you kind of find out something about a building. Oh, we got a call. Let's get this call. Hello, caller. You on the air?
Yeah, I was wondering if that is Thomas Cafe.
There were several businesses that occupied that space over the years, and honestly, I don't remember specifically, but I do know there was a Thomas Cafe there on Main Street, so it very well could have been in this space. But I don't know specifically. I have a list here of businesses that were in there. There was American Optical was in there for a while. There were a couple of attorneys, James Grissom, attorney, and Thomas Burgess, attorney. Coley's Beauty Shop was in there. Frank Wilson Agency was in there. So there were a number of businesses in there over the years. Whether the cafe was there, I just honestly don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Have a good evening. Okay. All right, so let's move on then, Lee. Number 3, if you would. Quite often buildings will be identified by whoever built them or whoever first occupied them or who they were built for. This building, as you see there in the caption, is identified as the Phillips Building. It was built in 1907. The address is 126 Northwest Main Street, which of course puts it on the Nash County side of Main Street. You see it's the 2-story brick office building designed by John C. Stout in the Beaux Art style. 4 pilasters with Corinthian capitals flank the facades, 3 window bays, keystone arches surmount the central entrance, and second-story windows. By the way, this is all wordage directly from this National Historical Registry, and a lot of it, frankly, went right over my head when I first saw it. I had to do Google searches on some of these descriptions to find out exactly what they were. But whoever put this thing together went to some length to not only identify that it had a certain amount of windows and doors, but also they identify them by the type of architecture, particularly with the trim and so forth. So it was kind of interesting to read through these historical registry descriptions of these old buildings. But this one here, as I said, 126 Northwest Main Street, built in 1907. Okay. As I said, after last week's show, I got an email from one of our viewers who sent me some pictures of old buildings that he happened to have in his collection. Some of these I had myself, some I did not. But it was really neat to take a look back. So Lee, if you would, let's put up item number 4 for our viewers. This picture is from 1900, and it's the 100 block of Sunset Avenue looking east toward the railroad tracks. And of course, as you come across the tracks from the east side of town, in this day and age, it's a one-way street, of course, but back in 1900, it was a two-way dirt road, obviously. So these would have been the first buildings you'd come to on the right-hand side if you're coming from the east side of Rocky Mountain across the railroad tracks onto Sunset Avenue, headed west. So the caption here reads, looking east in the 100 block. Oh, I just said that backwards. This is looking east. My apologies. Looking east is, to be exact, numbers 110, 112, 114 Sunset Avenue, and all 3 establishments were under the management of Mr. J.D. Odom, who was a dealer in horses, mules, vehicles, harnesses, feedstuff, farming implements, furniture, fertilizer, and in general merchandise. The store with the awning still stands today. By the way, I'm not sure when this picture was taken. Obviously, these buildings don't look anything like this today, but this was, I think, taken from a book. Though, frankly, I think I've seen this picture before in the newspaper, so it could have been from the Rocky Mountain Telegram, too. It's a neat old picture going back. The Rocky Mountain Record, we mentioned a week or so ago, was actually a publication of the Rocky Mountain Chamber of Commerce in the early 1900s, as opposed to being a standalone separate newspaper like the Evening Telegram, for example. It was a publication of the Rocky Mountain Chamber of Commerce. Okay, Lee, let's move on to number 5. This picture you're looking at here, of course, is 1900. In 1906, this picture, here you go, same basic view, 100 block of Sunset looking east. And so, anyway, these buildings didn't change very much in the 6 years between these two pictures were taken. And you see the caption, J.D. Odom was still on the 3 businesses that were shown. And we have shown these businesses in prior shows. I think we, in fact, showed a more recent version of them week before last when we first got on this segment of these old buildings and when they were built. So anyway, and then number 6, Lee, if you would. This is Main Street in 1911, and you see the caption, 1911 saw the establishment of Rocky Mount institutions. The Telegram, 2 of Rocky Mount's institutions. The Telegram, Rocky Mount's first daily newspaper, is pictured here in an early location. The corner property, known as Drugstore Corner, was later occupied by Baldwin's department store. Okay, so right there, kind of to the left of the screen there, that building you're looking at there is the old Baldwin's department store. Of course, Main Street there to your right. Sunset comes in from the left there. Okay, all right, Lee, and finally number 7. Sunset Avenue looking west. This picture is from 1914, and you see there's the Planters Bank there on the left. Again, that's Baldwin. Well, would later be Baldwin's. It wasn't in 1914, but in later years it would become Baldwin's department store on the right, and of course right in the middle there is Sunset Avenue. And we're not exactly sure. This picture was captioned as being 1914. It very well could be a little bit later than that. There seems to be an awful lot of technology advancement. You see the power lines running there, top part of the picture. And it looks like in this picture the streets are paved by now. So there was some question about the accuracy of the dating of this picture. And that's quite common, frankly. I see this all the time. We're looking at old pictures. Because sometimes they're dated by someone's recollection. Sometimes they're dated by looking at an automobile, for example, in the picture, or a business. You can read the sign out front and kind of get an idea of when it could have been in existence and date it from that angle. But anyway, the picture was captioned as being from 1914. Like I said, I'm inclined to agree with my viewer that it's probably a little bit later than that. Still a neat old picture. Okay, so I mentioned at the top of the show that I had Eric had actually called me, and we talked a little bit. He came by the shop too. We talked a little bit about an old building down on Nash Street that was at one point occupied by Al Koch and Henry. And so, as much as I tried, I just could not place the building he was referring to. I just couldn't wrap my head around where it was, what it looked like, anything about it. So of course, I took off to digging and see what I could find. It was quite an interesting story, in fact. What started out as being Al Koch, Little, and Henry in 1912 went through several renditions of businesses. It was called for a while the Merchants Notion Company. It was called the Rocky Mount Dry Goods Company. And in 1971, it became Harris Cuthrell. And so it was a neat kind of storyline there between not only the way the business changed names, the way the business moved from place to place over the years, but also the people that were involved in starting it and running it. And one gentleman in particular kind of stood out in this whole scenario, and that was Mr. Al Koch, Mr. Norwood Lee Al Koch. And so I kind of focused the majority of my effort in researching on Mr. Al Koch, and but obviously there were other people involved too over the years. And so I thought it would be neat just to kind of go back and look at the history of the business. And so what I did was I went back and pulled, you've heard me mention the Rocky Mount City directories that I have in digital format on my computer in my office. I don't have one for every year, but I have several years going back to 1908, 1909. I've got a 1912, 1913. And in some years they did that. They combined 2 years into one printing. But anyway, long story short, I went back and started looking through my city directories to see when the business was in operation, how it started, the principal people involved with it, and so forth. And so I put together this little synopsis here, if you will, and we'll go into more details as the show goes on. But number 8, if you would, Lee, put that up on the screen for our viewers. This is basically a collection of excerpts from the Rocky Mount City directories going back 1914, 1915, up through 1925. And we'll start off with the very top of the list. You see there, Al Koch, Little, and Henry. Mr. N.L. Al Koch, Mr. C.C. Little, Mr. S.S. Henry were the principals. They started this business called Al Koch, Little, and Henry. They were located on Sunset Avenue near Main Street at that time. there on the corner. And so we'll get a little bit further on that in a minute. Mr. Alcock himself lived at 435 Falls Road. Mr. Little, Mr. Charles C. Little, you see there, who was the second principal owner of the business, lived at Raleigh Road near Nashville Road. And then lastly, you see Mr. Samuel S. Henry. In later years, he would be referred to as S.S. Henry quite often, lived at 225 Western Avenue. There was a shipping clerk that worked there, Mr. George Lambeth, who, as it turns out, was the brother-in-law of Mr. Alcock. You see, he lived there at 435 Falls Road also. Okay, then by 1925, Norwood L. Alcock was the president of Alcock and Henry. Mr. Little is no longer in the picture. And you see president there, I want to draw your attention there to the president, Mr. W.H. Horn. And we'll show you a picture in a minute, refresh your memory. W.H. Horn, William H. Horn, lived over on what at that time was referred to as Raleigh Street. It's now Discovery Street. It's right around the corner from the old Orion Wilson Junior High School, which was, of course, in the very early 1900s, Rocky Mount High School. But that real fancy house that shamefully is just falling apart. In fact, I've not been by there recently. Eric said he thinks it's been totally demolished by now. But we shared a bunch of pictures with it here. It's been several months ago of that house. And so anyway, you see down at the bottom there, Mr. Henry's listing as being the vice president of Alcock and Henry Incorporated, and also of the electric shop. Okay, so Mr. Horn was involved with at least two different businesses that we know of, and there were some others. At the very bottom of this list, you see Mr. J. Henry Cuthrell Jr., who at that time was a salesman with the, in 1925, it was, of course, just Alcock and Henry. So anyway, all right, so let's move on, Lee. Number 9, I mentioned that Mr. William H. Horn was the vice president in 1925 of Alcock and Henry. And this is the house that he lived in 1925. It was 327 Raleigh Street then. It's now referred to as Discovery Street. But if you're headed down Marigold Street from Main Street, headed east on Marigold Street, you'll go past the old Rocky Mount High School, later to be Orion Wilson Junior High School. And when you get to what is now Discovery Street, you turn right, go a little ways down, and this house will be on your left if it's still there. And Eric said he thinks it's been torn down. I've not been by myself and verified that, but when I was there and took this picture, the house was really about to fall in on itself. It was in horrible, horrible shape. Too far gone, in fact, to even attempt to salvage. I was able to kind of get up close enough to peek inside and see that all the interior walls had been stripped of anything of any value, moldings, any kind of decorative work, doorknobs. I mean, anything that could be salvaged or sold or otherwise repurposed had already been stripped out of it. And so it's just a shame. That was a beautiful, beautiful home at one time. But over the years, it being where it was, it just fell into neglect. It became rental property for many, many years. And then it sat vacant for a dozen years or so, I think. And so sadly, if it has been demolished by now, that's probably about the best we hope for the home because it was such bad shape. I see by the clock it's time for our first commercial break. So Lee, bring it back to me. We're going to take this commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about Mr. Alcock and about Alcock Henry and the migration of that business over the years and how it morphed into Harris Cuthrell in the 1970s. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Wayback Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
There's a main nerve that leaves your back that goes into your hip and goes down your leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. A back injury can put pressure on that nerve, causing pain, numbness, tingling. Chiropractors can actually help that. At the Hammer Chiropractic Center on Sunset, we know exactly what to do. We have very good relationships with the doctors in Rocky Mount. We like to co-manage people's care. Some medications may help us do our jobs, and our jobs may help their medications work better.
And we're back. If you're just tuning in, you're watching Wayback Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcox. We're talking about, at the moment anyway, what started out as being Alcoke, Little, and Henry, which was a notions, dry goods and notions business. If you're not familiar with the term notions, it's kind of a catch-all phrase for dry goods in general, clothing, things that can sometimes include food, but are more along the lines of clothing and shoes and things that of that nature, I guess is the best way to say it. And as it turns out, Notions stores were very popular at the turn of the century, even into the 1930s and 40s. And people would go to these Notions stores and pick up all kinds of household supplies, dry goods in general, flour, sugar, so forth, that was also available at the grocery store. But they would get things like underwear and socks and shoes and bed linens and things. So it was kind of a country store in one sense, even in the city, but they carried a lot of different things, and they kind of separated themselves into a niche market that wasn't quite filled by any other business at that time. So anyway, and I mentioned Mr. Alcoke. Mr. Norwood L. Alcoke, as it turns out, was actually the great-grandfather of a friend of mine, a guy I went to school with. And if those familiar with the Perky family here in Rocky Mount, Doug Perky and I went to school together. His father was named after Mr. Norwood Alcoke, and so was his older brother. Doug's older brother and father were both named after Mr. Alcoke. Doug himself was named after Mr. Alcoke's wife. Her name was Marion, I forget her last name now, but anyway, or middle name I should say. But Doug carries her middle name to this day, his great-grandmother. So it was interesting to me to make that connection between this Mr. Alcoke and someone that I knew personally. And one of the things that I found out was that even in the very early days, 1900, 1910, somewhere along in there, Mr. and Ms. Alcoke were already very prominent people in Rocky Mount. They socialized with the very wealthy in Rocky Mount. They entertained guests at their home. They were featured guests at other people's homes. They traveled extensively. And so as an example of that, I found an article that appeared in the News and Observer, believe it or not, about an event that took place here in Rocky Mount. It was in January the 18th of 1910, number 10 if you will. They put this up for our viewers on the screen. And this was, the headline simply reads, Ms. Alcoke Entertains. And quite often, it was the missus that took care of the entertainment. It's a short article. It says, from 3 until 6 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Mrs. N.L. Alcoke entertained a number of friends at her home, number 429 Western Avenue. Cards proved the evening's entertainment or amusement, and the 2 score of friends enjoyed bridge for several hours. Refreshments and 2 courses were served. After voting the evening as most pleasantly spent, the guests departed for their respective homes. And this is a list of people that were in attendance at this little gathering here of prominent ladies from Rocky Mount. I'm not going to read them all, but just to rattle off a few names. Mrs. W.E. Fenner, that name rings a bell, the Fenner Warehouse people. Mrs. T.H. Battle of the Battle family from Rocky Mount Mills, of course. G.L. Wimberly, later involved with Wimberly Gregory. Mrs. J.C. Brazel. Mrs. F.P. Spruill, the attorney, of the attorney firm here. Mrs. D.D. Chuthrow. Mrs. F.P. Rollins, Mrs. Sam Jenkins, Mrs. J.W. Acock, no relation to me, by the way, it's a different spelling entirely. But the list goes on, and most every one of these people were members of very prominent families or married to someone who was a prominent businessman in Rocky Mount. And I saw several types of articles like this. where Ms. Alcock would either host these parties or these events, these gatherings, or she would be the guest of honor at one. And quite often her and her husband would attend these events together. In this case, as you can see, it was a ladies' event, if you will. And so the husbands weren't obviously invited. But again, these were very up-and-coming, socially affluent people who spent a good part of their spare time entertaining and being entertained by their friends. Okay, Lee, let's move on then. I found this 1912-1913 listing to be quite interesting, and I wanted to share with you a couple of things about this. I've got highlighted there with the red stars. First of all, at the very top, in the category of clubs, we talked a little bit in the past about the Sagamore Club. It was located at 152 North Main Street. R.S. Gorham was president. I.W. Rose was the vice president. F.P. Sproul was the secretary. And like I said, these were just random listings here all on one page of different types of organizations and clubs and so forth. You see there under commercial organizations, Chamber of Commerce, Masonic Temple, R.B. Davis Jr. was president, F.A. Hampton was the first vice president, Dr. M.R. Braswell was the second vice president. If that name rings a bell to you, it should. Dr. M.R. Braswell was Mark Braswell, whose son was Thomas Hackney Braswell. The local library is named after him. Going further down, Retail Merchants Association, you see Mr. Richard T. Fountain was the secretary of this organization. And then down near the bottom here, under TPA, the Travelers Protective Association, Post 11, meets at the Ricks Hotel. Norman L. Alcock was the president. Okay, the TPA, the Travelers Protective Association, was an organization started in the late 1882, I think is when they got started. And it was basically an organization to protect and to serve traveling salesmen. Quite often, these gentlemen were traveling alone. They were by themselves. They had no accompaniment. And so as they would go from town to town, peddling their goods, quite often they were really at the mercy of the townspeople. If they got fortunate enough to be given good information and be directed to a good hotel or some place to stay, a boarding house or whatever for the night, they fared pretty well. Quite often they might be directed somewhere behind the building where they get knocked in the head and robbed or whatever. And so this organization was put together basically to help look out for each other, if you will, these traveling salesmen. And so it actually still in existence today. It's been around since, like I said, 1882, I think, when it started. In 1890, it almost went out of business. It was just kind of floundering. And so there was an idea came about to actually provide an insurance policy for the members. And so they integrated an insurance policy for the members, and that kind of aroused enthusiasm, and more members joined, and those that were teetering on leaving decided to stay. And so it was that adding the insurance policy to the organization that kind of gave it the footings, if you will, to last throughout the years. And they're still in existence today. So, but anyway, Mr. Norwood L. Alcock was the president. As it turns out, he got his start in the notions business as a traveling salesman. That's how he got started. He worked for a couple of different companies and traveled about, and kind of got his feet wet, so to speak. Got an idea about how to source product, how to get stuff shipped in, and how to. He made contacts and so forth, and that's what allowed him to venture into business for himself and eventually start the Alcock, Little, and Henry dry goods and notions business. Okay. Let's move on to number 12. I said earlier that the business started out with three gentlemen, Mr. Norwood Alcock, Mr. Charles C. Little, and Mr. S.S. Henry. Sadly, in 1918, Mr. Henry passed away. And so that was the first of the three partners. And sadly, he was only 40 years old. A very young man. And I think I read somewhere he had contracted some kind of illness and suffered briefly with it and finally passed away at 40 years old. But anyway, by 1918, there was no more Mr. Little. And so the business became just Norwood and Henry at that point, no more Little. Okay, Lee, let's move on then. Number 13. I went back and looked at an old Rocky Mount City map I had, and lo and behold, what you see circled there in red was identified as the location where Alcoke, Little, and Henry was located in 1917. This is a 1917 map, or at least a section of it. I did a screenshot of the larger map and zoomed in on this. But that little dot you see there on the corner of Sunset Avenue and Main Street in 1917 was the location of Alcoke, Little, and Henry. As I said earlier, the business moved around over the years, and they were in actually 3 or 4 different locations. By 1931, however, they had moved. So lead number 14, if you would. And even though the address is not listed on this particular advertisement, by 1931, they had moved into the location at 131 Nash Street. Okay, you see the ad there. Now it's identified as Alcoke and Henry, wholesalers of dry goods and notions. And you see a listing there of their products: underwear, sweaters, pants, hosiery, blankets, shirts, overalls, knit goods, gloves, suspenders, belts, sheets, quilts, comfort, I think it's supposed to be comforters, but anyway, curtains, and many other lines. Standard brands we handle include Hanes, and this is 1931, by the way. They carried Hanes, Kenmore, Mayo and Prince, Albert underwear, Hillcrest, Dillon, Gilt Edge, and Blue Buckle overalls. We buy, as far as possible, merchandise made in Carolina. Carolina products for Carolina people was their slogan. May we have the opportunity of serving you. And like I said, the address is not listed here, but by 1931, they were in a 5-story building. And that's what blows my mind, is that you would think that anyone around in 1980s, because it was still there in the 1980s, would remember that building. And for the life of me, I cannot remember it. I don't know why I'm drawing a mental block on this, but I just cannot seem to recall that particular building. I'll show you a picture here in a minute. Before we get to the picture, let's move on to number 15. By 1938, the business had changed names. And they also now have listed on their ads the address, 131 Nash Street. And this is a congratulatory ad, by the way. We've talked about these many times on the show, where a new business would open up and other local businesses would place a congratulatory ad congratulating the new business on being in business, and also the fact that they supplied part or all of a particular service or product or whatever to get the new business up and running. So the ad here says, "Congratulations, T.A. Williams, Battleboro, North Carolina, on your fine new store. We supplied notions and clothing." And then, of course, they're advertised now as Merchants Notion Company. So we changed the name from the original of Alcoke, Little, and Henry. And then Mr. Little passed away, so then the name changed to Alcoke and Henry in 1931. And then by 1938, the business became known as Merchants Notion Company. And I've seen the word notion with an S behind it and without the S. So this particular ad, you notice there is no S. It just says Merchants Notion Company. But notions was kind of a generic term for lots of different, and you see there in the article, in the ad itself, it says, "We supplied notions," with the S on the end, "and clothing." So I think the ad was supposed to say Merchants Notions Company, but of course it didn't. All right, Lee. The very same day that this ad here appeared, another ad appeared literally on the same page, the same type of congratulatory ad, number 16 if you would, Lee. And you see this ad identifies that they were a contributing business. It said, "We helped stock his new store with our notions." You notice at the bottom, Rocky Mount Textile Company. Now, let's stop here for a moment. This kind of threw me for a loop because what I found out was that in 1932, literally a year after the Merchants Notion Company, well, Alcoke and Henry, had started there at the 131 Nash Street location. The very next year, Mr. Alcoke left. I don't know if he was forced out, if he just made a decision to leave and start his own company, start from scratch again, but he left. And he started his own company. It was called Rocky Mount Textile Company, okay? When I first saw that, I thought, well, it was something like a mill, maybe like a Rocky Mount Mills or some kind of cotton mill. No, it was another notion store, just like the one he left, but it was called Rocky Mount Textile Company, and they were a dry goods and notion store themselves. And so this ad appeared, like I said, on the same day, the same page as the other Merchants Notion Company ad appeared. It's an identical type of ad. They almost use the exact same wording, in fact. The Merchants Notion ad said, "We supplied notions and clothing." The Rocky Mount Textile ad, as you see, says, "We helped stock his new store with our notions." And by the way, that was another thing I found out about these dry goods and notion stores. Quite often, they would provide inventory. They would, in other words, be the source for inventory for other stores in Rocky Mount. Other clothing stores, for example, would buy some of their merchandise from these dry goods stores like Merchants Notions or Rocky Mount Textile. And so I guess for a lack of a better term, they were almost like a wholesale business. That's not to say they didn't also sell retail too. I'm fairly sure they did, but it looks like a lot of their business was at the wholesale level. Okay. I mentioned Mr. Alcoke had left, and I'm not sure why that was. For whatever reason, he chose to leave. And I don't want to imply that he was somehow wronged or somehow mistreated. I don't have any proof or evidence of that. And I don't have any evidence that he left angry or upset or mad with his former partners. I just don't know. But for whatever reason, he left in 1932 and started this company. I ran across a neat article, and I'm going to have Lee put up on the screen. The print is very small. It's a long article, and I'm just going to paraphrase what it says. There we go. This is a picture of Mr. Norwood Lee Alcoke in 1939, and the story tells, the caption beneath the picture says, "N.L. Alcoke, baseball's more than a hobby." And the story goes on to talk about when Mr. Alcoke came to Rocky Mount in 1899. Rocky Mount had a baseball team, but they were apparently very bad, a very bad team. And in fact, they got beat ruthlessly the first game he went to see. And so after the game was over, he went to the team leaders and coaches and so forth and said, "Hey, what can we do to get this team better? Because you guys really stunk it up out there on the field." And so immediately there became a gathering of minds, if you will. And Mr. Alcoke, being a fairly prominent businessman, had the resources to put some money into the baseball team. And for the next several years, he was almost a guaranteed attendee of every baseball game that took place in Rocky Mount. He supplied the team with uniforms and different things they needed. He was a huge baseball fan, obviously. And it's not an overstatement to say that Rocky Mount baseball came about and became what it eventually became in large part due to the efforts of N.L. Alcoke and his extreme interest in the sport itself, in the game of baseball. All right, I see it's time for our next commercial break, so Lee, let's bring it back to me. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about Mr. Alcoke and about the continued migration of the business and how the two businesses were kind of parallel in their goings on, if you will, throughout the years. Don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back with more Wayback Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
There's a main nerve that leaves your back that goes into your hip and goes down your leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. A back injury can put pressure on that nerve, causing pain, numbness, tingling. Chiropractors can actually help that. At the Hammer Chiropractic Center on Sunset, we know exactly what to do. We have very good relationships with the doctors in Rocky Mount. We like to co-manage people's care. Some medications may help us do our jobs, and our jobs may help their medications work better.
We are back. We're back. You know, after looking at the information I found and looking through the history and the progression of the Alcoke, Little and Henry dry goods and notions business over the years, I couldn't help but think about how different it was to be in business at the turn of the century in Rocky Mount. You know, from the time the railroad came through here in 1840, Rocky Mount began to expand its footprint, if you will, and it was large part due to local businesses that saw a need and fulfilled that need in a variety of ways. Certainly we had grocers who sold groceries, and certainly we had clothiers who sold clothing, and certainly we had people that took care of buggies and mules and horses and so forth, with blacksmiths and so forth. But these businesses that were these dry goods and notions, I just kind of have a mental picture of going to one of these places and just being in awe at so many different things. For those that remember J.W. Bone's store right at Sandy Cross, that's kind of what I had in mind. I used to walk in that place and look around and just go, oh my God, how in the world does he keep up what he's got in here? How did he know that he had whatever you needed? Not only did he know he had it, he knew where it was. Amongst 1,001 things, 1,000's obviously a low ball figure. It's probably 10,000 things in that store. But these places, they saw a niche, they saw a need, they saw an opportunity, and it made some of these individuals very wealthy men in a fairly short amount of time. And so Mr. Alcoke was certainly came along at the right time. From the time he hit Rocky Mount in 1899 up until his death in 1946, he was very, 1944 I believe, I think I misspoke there. But he was very much in tune with what it was that Rocky Mount was looking for, what it needed, and like so many other businessmen of that time frame, the Z.B. Bullock and Robert Henry Ricks, and so many of these men who were just seemed to be at the right place at the right time to start a business and become very successful with it. So let's move on, Lee. Number 18, I mentioned that in 1932, Norwood Alcoke left the partnership and started his own company called Rocky Mount Textile Company. And it was operated right here. Now this picture is from 2008. When I went to Google and looked up the address of where the Rocky Mount Textile Company was located, that building is no longer there. But one neat thing about Google is when you do a Google search for an address, quite often it will give you an option to go back and look at the same address for various years. And it just so happened that when I went to this address, there was nothing from the latest I think was 2022. There was a listing from 2019 and one from 2012. The oldest one was 2008. And when I went and looked at the 2008 picture, lo and behold, the building was still there in 2008. Sometime between 2008 and 2012, the building you're looking at right here was demolished. It's no longer there. But this right here on the corner of Washington Street and Marigold Street, I think the address is actually 368. I've got it somewhere in my notes. But anyway, this is where Norwood Alcoke moved and started his own dry goods and notion business in 1932, and he operated here for a number of years at this building right here. And like I said, sadly, it's now gone, but that's where it was, and that's what it looked like, at least in 2008 before it was torn down. Okay, let's move on then. Number 19, in 1944, this ad appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram, and this was the first picture I ran across that showed an actual image of the building itself at 131 Nash Street, where Alcoke and Henry moved in 1931. I'm not 100% certain on this, but I believe, just based on what I saw, that they had this building built. I believe they contracted this building to be built, this 5-story building on Nash Street that started out as Alcoke and Henry and later became Merchants Notion Company. And so this was the ad. It says, serving the merchants of Eastern North Carolina and Virginia, dry goods and notions since 1913. The business actually started in 1912, and I've seen a couple different variations on dates, but I did find a listing for them in 1912. So they were in business as Alcoke, Little, and Henry in 1912. Okay, so there's the picture. So I wanted to see if I could extract the building itself from this ad and get a better look. So number 20, if you would, Lee. This is an actual kind of a zoom in, if you will, on the building itself. And at the very top of the building, you see the National Underwear Company there, Merchants Notion Company. And I mentioned earlier that I had seen the word Notion sometimes with an S on it and sometimes without. There on the building itself, you see it says Merchants Notion Company, no S. So I guess technically the name of the company was, at least in 1944, by the time they changed the name from Alcock and Henry, they changed it to Merchants Notion Company without the S. But anyway, that's the building, 5-story building on 131 Nash Street, and it just blows my mind, and I cannot remember that building, but I cannot remember. Okay, lead number 21. February 27th, 1946, this little short article appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram, and the headline reads, Notion Company is incorporated. Let me get this call. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
All right, this picture you were just showing of that 5-story building,
Right.
that was an alley in between that building and the lower building closer to the camera.
Right.
It was there on the backside of where Towel Town was, and that alley went back down there. Later on, to the backside of Charles's department store, and the Bishop Laundry had a boiler room back there, a commercial laundry, and it went back in there to Seal Test Milk Company. In the 50s, had a little branch operation there where they loaded milk trucks with Seal Test milk.
Okay, that's interesting.
That alley, was basically the alley that went behind Belt Towers, and later what was the other store, Towel Town.
Mm-hmm.
That alley went across Nash Street and went in between those buildings that you just showed back to the back side of Bishop Laundry.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, if you could go back and leave that last picture, if you would, just so we can get the viewers take a look at that, what he's talking about there. There, can you zoom in on that, Lee? You can see there's a gap between those two buildings, and that's what he's talking about. There was an alleyway there.
In between that tall building and the building that's not as tall, that was an alley, a commercial alley that went away from Nash Street back up to the back side of Bishop Laundry.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, buddy. Thank you. Okay, let's go back to where we were at number 21. Like I said, the headline here, this is February 27, 1946, Notion Company is incorporated. The Merchants Notion Company, Rocky Mount, today filed a certificate of incorporation in the Office of the Secretary of State in Raleigh, according to information received here. The company, which deals in notion and dry goods of every description, has been in operation under the present firm title since 1931. At that time, the company changed ownership from a similar business maintained by Alcock and Henry. During the following 13 years until 1943, it was changed into a partnership between J.D. Blunt, L.B. Morris, and J.H. Cutherill, Jr. The business was operated as a corporation. The filing of the certificate today by the concern marks the reincorporation of the company. So each time the name changed, it slightly altered the corporate standpoint of the business. And so this is an article from 1946 stating that they had filed for to reincorporate under the new ownership. Okay, Lee. Let's go on then. Number 22. Sadly, July 31st, 1946, the obituary from Mr. N.L. Alcock appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram. He was 70 years old. And it goes on to talk about that he came to Rocky Mount in 1899. He was connected with Quinn Marshall Company of Lynchburg, Virginia. And in 1912, he organized Alcock, Little and Henry Company, which later became the Alcock and Henry Notion. In 1932, Mr. Alcock organized the Rocky Mount Textile Company, which he ran until his health forced him to retire. He served as president of the Chamber of Commerce during World War I. He was a member of the board of directors of the First National Bank. He was a member of the Church of the Good Shepherd. In 1900, he was married to Miss Marion E. Lambeth of Richmond, Virginia. But like I say, I think I said earlier 1944, but it was 1946 when he died. And so, of course, by this time, he had long parted ways with his previous partners, and the business that started out with his name continued on many years after he left them in various different names. Okay, then number 23. This is just a listing I found in the Find a Grave website. You see there Norwood Lee Alcock, born March 19th, 1875, died July 30th of 1946. He's buried at Pineview Cemetery. Sometimes these Find a Grave listings have some neat information regarding children and so forth. Sometimes there are other information about other family members and so forth too. But this one was kind of sparse, but I wanted to include it anyway. Okay, kind of an overview of Mr. Alcock himself. I put this little chart together here. Norwood Alcock and the Rocky Mount Tesla Company. He started the Tesla Company in 1932. In 1934, he was listed as a salesman in the Rocky Mount City Direction 34. He was listed as a salesman for the Rocky Mount Textile Company. In 1936, he was still listed as Rocky Mount Textile Company president. And the address listed at 238 South Washington Street. That's the address I showed you a minute ago on the corner there of Washington Street and Marigold Street, 238 South Washington. And that's where he was up until 1940. In 1940, he moved the business to 107 Marigold Street, right around the corner from its previous location on the corner of Marigold and South Washington Street. By 1942, he was just listed as a salesman, traveling salesman, home at 302 West Grand Avenue. By 1944, his health began to falter, and he was going out of business. In fact, he went out of business. This ad appeared at the bottom here in the Rocky Mount Telegram, offering for sale my entire stock of hosiery, etc. Also, store fixtures, liberal discount for cash, N.L. Alcock, Rocky Mount Textile Company. Notice the street address here, 145 Nash Street. So he moved this one business to Rocky Mount Textile Company 3 different times. He started out at 238 South Washington, moved it in 1940 to 107 Marigold Street, and by 1944 he was going out of business. The business was located at 145 Nash Street. Now think about that for a minute. 131 Nash Street was the Rocky Mount Merchants, which was formerly Alcock and Little and Henry. And they were still there, by the way, in 1946 44 when he's going out of business. They're still there. They're still in business, still operating. So literally about 3 or 4 doors down from his former business partners, he moves his business at 145 Nash Street. Now, if that's not odd enough, and that to me just struck me as very odd that they would move that close to a competitor, a former business partner, and so forth, but he did. So after he closed up, let me back up a minute. Before he went there, I wanted to see what was in that space before he moves his business there from over on Marigold Street over to 145 Nash Street. So number 25, Lee, this ad appeared at Rocky Mount Telegram January 11/21/1941. Mrs. Vine's tea room was at 145 Nash Street. Okay. Number 26, Lee, September 13th, 1944. This was just before he went into that space. Arnold L. Adams Wholesale Company. I never knew. My father used to work for Adams Wholesale. They started out, that I thought anyway, as far as I knew, over off Cokie Road over there, back off of Pitt Street, around the corner of Pitt Street. But anyway, they were at one point here at 145 Nash Street. I never knew that. Okay, so anyway, by 1944, he moved in this place apparently right after Adams Wholesale moved out, because they were there in September 44. And for whatever reason, Mr. Alcock occupied that space too for a very short period of time and then decided to go out of business. Okay, Lee, let's move on to number 27 here. This is an ad that appeared in 1946. You see Merchants Notion Company there, and there's another shot of the building. I'm almost out of time. Let's move on, Lee, number 28. Jack and Francis Restaurant at Nash Street. They were down near the end of Nash Street and Church Street down there. Number 29, Lee, Rocky Mount Dry Goods Company Incorporated, 131. The Rocky Mount Merchants had changed name again. Now it's Rocky Mount Dry Goods Company, same address, 131. You see here, this is a listing of what was in the 100 block of Nash Street in 1963. Draw your attention to the bottom of the list there. 131, of course, Rocky Mount Dry Goods. 139 was the T.J. Brazel Sports Shop. 145, Jack and Francis Restaurant and Grill. Okay, by 1965, Rocky Mount Dry Goods was still located at 131 Nash Street. By 1967, they were advertising Converse canvas shoes and so forth, tennis shoes, sneakers we call them. 1971, they moved out onto Church Street in the location that they occupied until they went out of business sometime around 1984. And I'm sorry, we ran slam out of time. Lee, bring it back to me. Let's wrap things up tonight. I had a few more pictures I wanted to get to, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to all of those. But in any case, this 5-story building at 131 Nash Street was torn down in 1984. I was, of course, overseas in the Navy then, so that's why I didn't ever remember it being torn down. I'm a little disappointed in myself, and I did not remember the building itself. I don't know how. I know I had to ride by it at least a few times during my growing up years in Rocky Mount. It being there all during my youth, I had to have ridden by it. Anyway, thank you for tuning in tonight, folks. Thank those that called in. We appreciate you as always. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Be kind to one another. And we'll see you next week with more Wayback Wednesday. Good night.